Okay, so share screen. Okay, let us continue with the halacha of lo sachmod. You're not allowed to covet. So we had said that there are really two prohibitions in the Torah. One is lo tachmod and the other one is lo titaveh. Lo tachmod is that you're not allowed to desire something that belongs to your friend to the point where you go ahead and put pressure um, and create a situation where he ends up relinquishing that item of his that you want, or his wife, or whatever that is, right? In other words, so that's an Isser de Oraisa, but there's also a separate Isser de Oraisa of Lo Titaveh, which is even just to desire your friend's item, even if it doesn't result in action. Okay, so and then what we were saying is, and this is where I think we left off yesterday, that you're not in violation of lo tachmod until you actually acquire the item that you had coveted. And why don't we start this again? Mem Aleph. Aval im chomed kela v'chafetzav shel chavero sherotza sheyilo gam kein osam hadvarim kmo lechavero ein boze isur. But let's say you desire to have the same thing as your friend, but not that you want his specific item. Like your friend is driving a Tesla, so you want a Tesla also. Okay, that doesn't mean that you're in violation of this prohibition. It may be a sign of poor character that you're so shallow that you just want it because your friend, your neighbor has one also, but it's not a Torah violation. And you're perfectly within your halachic right to buy it for yourself from the marketplace. Because the prohibition that we're dealing with here is where you want that which belongs to your friend and you pressure him into selling it to you. Od nira lenias daiti. It would also seem to me the dafka bechomed chayfetz mitzuyam shemotze chen be'inav v'rotze dafka oso chayfetz. It seems to me that the prohibition is only when you are desirous of a particular item and you want that specific item. It's a one-of-a-kind kind of thing. Avalim rotze liknos eze chayfetz ba'ofen klali mutar levakesh zos mechavero af im osezeh al yedei bakasha v'haftzara. He says it's also permitted. Let's say your friend has a Tesla. You could easily buy the Tesla from somewhere else. There's nothing wrong with you putting pressure on him to see if he would like to sell his Tesla to you. Maybe you figure you can get a better price if you buy it from him than if you buy it from somewhere else. So you're not in violation if you do that. Again, it may be poor form. It may be a sign of poor character if you put pressure on him unduly, but you're not in violation of this particular prohibition that we're discussing now. Okay. So, but then we said that there's a separate prohibition, and that's what we're going to see now, which is, here, we just read it. He says, so you're not in violation of lo tachmod until you actually acquire the object through your efforts, right? Umisha shenifte belibo v'chashav hechi kneh chayfetz zeh. But from the moment that you are sort of aroused with desire in your heart, and you're thinking to yourself, how can I get that from my neighbor? Then avar below titaveh, then you are in violation of you shall not desire. And because that desire that is sort of ignited within your emotions is something that starts as soon as it enters into your heart. And the reason why it's something insidious is because it leads to the violation of lo tachmod, and lo tachmod will eventually lead to the violation of gezel, and gezel will eventually lead to murder. And so therefore it's wrong for you to even start to desire that which belongs to your friend. So that's what we talked about yesterday. We talked about the Ibn Ezra. So he says, over below titave. Meaning that once you start thinking to yourself, how can I convince my friend to relinquish that object? Right? So once you start thinking in those terms, then you're in violation. Avar below titave, the chamor lo titave lo tachmod. He says, in a certain respect, the violation of lo titave is more stringent or more harsh than the violation of lo tachmod. The lo tachmod galilan kra de'ino over ad sheyikach hachefetz shechamad. He says because lo tachmod can only be violated when you actually physically take possession of the object that you desired. Masha'en kein lo titave over af im lo asamaisa. Whereas by lo titave, it's possible to be in violation without doing anything, with just sitting in your armchair at home. Right? V'yesh omrim degam lo titave dino kilo tachmod ve'in over rakisha asamaisa v'shana alav hakasav lavor beveis lavin uv'shulchan aruch simin shin and tes if yud pasuk kedei rishana. There is a second opinion that is cited in the poskim that you are only in violation of lo titave when you actually act upon it. However, the Shulchan Aruch says no. We go like the first opinion, where there's two separate prohibitions for two separate stages of this coveting. The first stage is lo titaveh. The second stage is lo tachmod. Okay, now v'hakone davar v'chulei, and then he said basically. That the last part of this is that halamadata shamitavela shel chaver over belav echad v'hakona davar shitava behefzer shitzer bo. He says, so what you see from here is that even just having a desire in your heart makes you in violation of one prohibition, and v'hakona davar shehitaveh. But then if you actually acquire it through pressure that you place on your friend, or through multiple requests, either through yourself or through your friends, hareza over bishnei lavin, then you're in violation of two mitzvahs of the Torah. And that's the reason why it says lo tachmod and lo titaveh. So the Imrei Yaakov just points out, he says, in this particular issue, there's a machlokus in the Rishonim. Diyesh omrim daha di isa bebava metzia heya medbeis lo sachmod below dami mashmalahu hakavana hi dechein hu ha'emes. He says, there is a statement in the Gemara that says that the prohibition of lo tachmod in people's minds sounds like you're coveting something without being willing to pay for it. So according to that opinion, Shari lahaftzir l'fayeset haba'alim shein karlo et beito okelav. Then according to that, it would be permissible, according to this first statement of the Gemara, it would be permissible as long as you are able to be a good convincer, you're very persuasive, and you persuade your friend to sell him your house or a certain object that he has in his house. And according to this first opinion, you're not in violation. You're only in violation if you put pressure on him to relinquish it without paying him for it. V'im omer rodsa ani leka shuv lo sachman. And if the guy finally says, okay, I'll sell it to you, he's doing it of his own free will, so you're not in violation. V'chein kasvu ha-Tosfos Sanhedrin Chafei Hamid Beis. And Tosfos is of that same opinion as well. Avol, das ha-Rambam perak aleph mehilchos gezela, Dafilu im omer rodsa ani, and the Rambam disagrees, and this is the opinion that we're going like over here. The Rambam says that even if you finally are able to convince the owner that he is willing to sell it, ho'ol shebaliyado al yedei haftzara uvakasha yesh bo lav de lo sachma. But since he attained it through pressure and through continued petition, and until he finally relented, So then there's still a violation of lo sachmod. V'chein pirish b'shulchan aruch siman shinin tesif yodu chmoshe kasav kan harav. And that's how the Rav Shulchan Aruch paskins. Umikol makom ein lo din gazlan lifsol midoraisa leidus v'lishvua delo sachmo leinshi below dame mashma. However, and this is an important qualifier. When a person is established as a gazlan because he steals people's things without paying for them, so this person can no longer is disqualified now from certain privileges within the Jewish community. For example, when you're looking for a kosher witness, let's say for your child's wedding, so the halacha is you need what does it take to be a kosher witness? So the most important thing we think is that the guy, first of all, he can't be related to anybody in the wedding party, and he has to be Shomer Shabbos. But there's an equally important qualification, which is that he can't be a gazlan. He can't be a thief. Like, what if a guy is a known thief? Like, he's engaged in a business where he regularly swindles people out of money. So he can be wearing a very long black coat and a big, big black hat, but he's still can't be a kosher witness at your child's wedding. So what he's saying over here is that if a guy is a known gazlan, so he's pasul le'edus, he can't be a kosher witness. But if a person just did this violation, where he pressured someone into selling him an object of his, this does not disqualify him from being a kosher witness, because that's not something that people feel is a dastardly deed. In other words, all of society recognizes that stealing things without paying for them is just morally corrupt. And if a person gets into the habit of doing that, then he's such a sociopath that he can't be a reliable witness. But if a person violates lo tachmod, that's within the margins of acceptable behavior within society, even though the Torah says it's wrong and you mustn't do it. And therefore, if a person is guilty of lo tachmod, he put pressure on his friends, but eventually he paid for the object. The fellow finally agreed, and the guy paid good cash for it, fair market value. So then people don't view themselves as having done anything wrong, even though the Torah prohibits it. And for that reason, the person is not puzzled to be a witness. So that's an important point. Okay. And again, it all has to do with societal values at this point. Okay. And let's bivakasha mimenu, you repeatedly request of him to sell you the object. He says, Nira de dafka al yedei bakasha asur. He says, it only seems that if it's through petition, that it's asur to get him to sell you the object. Avol rashai lish elo imhu muchan lemochra. You are allowed to just ask him, would you be willing to sell this object to me? Right? In other words, you see a beautiful piece of art in your friend's house, and you say to him, this is absolutely stunning, absolutely stunning. Would you be willing to part with it if I paid you fair market value? There's nothing wrong with just inquiring. That's perfectly okay according to halacha. Even if it's something that normally a person wouldn't be selling it. It's like there's not a price tag on it that says for sale. You see it on his mantelpiece, right? He says, if it's something that that he has things for sale in his garage, of course, obviously that would be okay for you to ask him, how much would you be willing to sell this to me for? But even if it's something that's a private effect of his, he's got a fantastic, a Scotch collection, and he's got a 50-year-old bottle of Scotch. I just saw a picture on social media of a bottle of Scotch that was going for $50,000. It's a 50-year-old bottle of scotch. I can't fathom these things that people are willing to pay that kind of money. But so, people have in our community, I know about this, especially this time of year when people sell their chametz to me. Sometimes people put down $30,000, $40,000. People have very expensive scotch collections. So you go over to your friend's house and he wants to show you his expensive scotch collection. And you see a 27-year-old bottle of Macallan. There's nothing wrong with asking him, would you be willing, are you up to selling that? Would you be willing to sell that if I gave you a fair market value? Because that's the exact bottle that I've been looking for. Nothing wrong with asking him. But if he says, no, I'm sorry, it's not for sale. Once you hear that, if you proceed further than that, then you start becoming in violation of lo tachmon. You have to be careful. And here he says, take a look at the biur. Let's take a look what he says. He says, Nira la'anius daiti, the dafka yidei bakasha asur. That it's only after you start to petition him to sell it to you. Avol rashai lishaloto yimu muchan limkor kelavo beso. You're simple to just inquire whether he would be willing to sell it is perfectly permissible. Da'af shehim dvarim she'enam yuduim lo shehim omdim lihi macher. He says, because even though there's no indication that these personal possessions of his are for sale, sometimes, you never know. Sometimes a guy may own something that he's very proud of, but he also has in mind that if he could ever find a buyer for it, maybe he would be willing to part with it. People acquire stuff and then they become bored with it and they don't love it as much as they used to. So you never know. So v'lochein yeshlomer demashu kasuf harambam perak aleph mehilchos kuzei l'lacha yudbeis v'hetiku kan harav o bevakasha hakavana hi al yidei bakasha davka. He says, and therefore, when he says that you petition him, it means specifically by petitioning him after you've already inquired and he said it's not for sale. That's when it becomes prohibited. The she'ein tzarich davka lahaftzir mamish. He says it doesn't mean that you're putting pressure on him necessarily, but just even a repeated request to sell it after he's made it clear that he doesn't want to sell it makes you in violation of lo tachmod. But just to make the initial inquiry, he says there's no prohibition at all. The lo zu bilvad. Elelule demistafina hayef shalomer degama yidei bakasha in lesar elahecha shul yidei riboy bakasha or bakasha shehi kahaftzara kidalakaman. He says I would go even further, and I would say that the only prohibition is when there's repeated requests or requests that are like placing undue pressure on the owner. Dihine harambam kasav. Because if you look at the language of the Rambam, he says you either get a bunch of friends to try and persuade him, or you put pressure on him. The repeated language of the Rambam in various places where he makes reference to this halacha, it's always where there's pressure applied to the owner or some kind of tachbula, which we translate tachbula is a ruse or a scheme to try and get it from him. Mazir me harim, or I think that's the word me harim, ad shenikach v'chulei. B'sham b'mitzvah reish samach vav, mechalot panavu lahachbid alav, or hichbid alav v'herim. There should not be any kind of scheming, and herim is to even be deceptive in the way that you try to convince him. He says it therefore seems from the language of the Rambam that you're doing some kind of scheming or plotting in order to figure out a way to get it from him. Hachbada is weighing down, haftzara is pressuring, and harama is deception. Belashon haftzara vada yoter hu mebakashu chedematzinu nami dichsiv kachna is bir chasi b'chulei vayitzar bo vayikach. We find this language of haftzara in the Chumash, where when Yaakov and Esav meet each other after many years of being estranged, and Yaakov offers Esav gifts, and Esav initially refuses, but then it says that Yaakov applied pressure upon him until Esav finally accepted. So it seems like that, Yaakov made the original request, please take my gifts. And Esav said, no, I don't want. And there was an additional pressure that was applied to Esav until finally he accepted the gifts. Or Elashon Harav Simen Beis if Yudal V'Dog. V'al Ken Yesh Lefaris the Mashakos of Harambam B'Halacha Yud Beis O B'Vakasha Kavanasa De Riboy Bakasha O Sug Bakasha Shehi Kaftzar. And therefore, it seems to me that we're dealing with a pressurized request, not just a simple casual. Are you sure you don't want to sell it? Aval Ayidei Stam Bakasha Efshe Deshari. Okay, Ach L'Maiset Tzarech In Godol Miesh Lismoch Al Zeh Dihine Harambam V'chein Hatur Simen Shin Nuntes Asushtei Bavos Bedin Delo Sachmod. He says, I'm not really sure whether you can rely on what I'm saying to request a second time, because at the end of the day, both the Rambam and the Tur say that there are two stages of Lo Sachmod. The Bereisha Kasvu Kol HaChomed Avdo Obeso Shel Chavera O Kol Davar She'efshar Sheyikachenu Mimenu V'hirba Alav Rein V'hivtzir Bo Ad Shilakacho. He says, because when you first look at the way that the Rambam describes this halacha, is that you desire the servant or the house of your friend, and you place upon him pressure from other people to apply pressure on him to sell it to you. Hareza over below Sachmon. Uveseifa kasvu bava nosefes kol hinisaba beso o ishto v'chulei. And at the end of their words, they write a second time that if you desire the house or the wife of your friend. Uveprisha sham sifkat yud kasav zela sham deberation nakat gam kein beso yeshlomer demari b'mocher sheyeshlo batim harbe ve'efshar liknos mimenu bekalus. So the Prisha, in trying to understand why the Tur is repetitive in this statement, where he starts off by talking about you desire your neighbor's slave or his house, and then later on you desire your neighbor's house or his wife, right? Why does he say it two different places, two different examples, with house being mentioned in both places? So the Prisha says, in the first case, we're talking about where a person has multiple servants or multiple houses. And so it's very easy for him to part with one of his pieces of real estate. In the second case, the reason why it's more insidious is because you're requesting of your friend something that he only has one of, like a house or a wife. And therefore, these are things that he needs. So therefore, there's an even greater prohibition to apply pressure on him to part with them. He says, and therefore it seems like from the Prisha's explanation that in the first case, even though the guy has no problem parting with it, but you're still in violation of Lo Sachmod if you make that petition from him. Aval hama'ayin yira de lo kasha midi. The kavanas haprisha hu de bahashva legabe seifa she'mayri sheish lo bayis echad legabe ishto shehu vadei davar kasha mod lahasik mechavero. He says, but that's really not what the Prisha means. What the Prisha means is that he's trying to create a contrast between the first set of items and the second set of items. The first set of items that the Prisha says the Tur is addressing are things that a person will not have tremendous remorse after he parts with them because he has multiple items that are like that. He's a wealthy person. But in the second part, where he only has one of these things, he's only got one house or he's only got one wife, and by applying pressure on him to divorce his wife, so that's going to be very hard for him to recover from. Tachbulos, Mashen came to Sefer Mari Shikosh Lahasik of Olvadai Shagam Beresha Mari Ditzrach Lecholapachos Bakasha Beishtadlos. He says, and it doesn't mean that in the first case that the Torah addresses, just because the fellow has multiple of those same items, yes, it's easier to acquire them, but it's not. That doesn't mean to suggest that you're not putting any pressure on the guy. So therefore, what Rav Stern is basically just pointing out is that even though the language of the Torah may imply that even without any pressure at all, there's sometimes a prohibition of lo sachmod, he doesn't think that that's the case. Because even in the first case, the Rambam and the Torah both write that you put pressure on him. So therefore, it's clear that even when it's a commodity that your friend is not going to miss a huge amount because he's got other properties. He's got a whole fleet of boats at the pier. So by you asking if he'd be willing to sell you one of his boats, it's not a terrible thing that he's going to miss terribly. But at the end of the day, the prohibition, he sort of sticks with his original thesis, the prohibition is only when you put undue pressure on a guy, where you try to, he originally said, I'm sorry, it's not for sale. And you try other methods of trying to get him to part with it. So you send him a gift before Shabbos, and you have your friend call him, and you send him emails and letters, and you work on trying to break him down and to let him know how much you really want it. So that then becomes prohibited when you're placing pressure on a guy. So it's interesting because we look at this and we say, what could possibly be wrong with this? You're willing to pay for it, but the fact of the matter is that once a person tells you he doesn't want to part with his property, you really are not supposed to put pressure on him anymore, and it's a Torah violation. Okay, any questions or comments? Okay, if not, then let me just see if there's anything in the Likutim, because I couldn't see anything in the Likutim. No. Oh, he says in Likutim, he says, Isra lo tachmod hugami hu chomed l'tzorach mitzvah. He says, you're in violation of lo tachmod, even if you covet something that a person, your friend has, that's a mitzvah item. Kagon sefer Torah, tefillin, mezuzah, chai gavna. Even let's say you covet the sefer Torah that he just acquired, right? That's also a violation of lo tachmod. A lot of times people, are in a higher madrega because they covet the things that their friends have that are virtuous things, but you can still be in violation of not coveting. If you put pressure on your friend, sell me the Sefer Torah that you've just commissioned, and the guy says, no, I'm doing this in memory of my parents. And you say, well, I've never seen such a beautiful Sefer Torah. I'll pay you, more than what you're paying the sofer. So to put pressure on a guy like that is wrong. It's an issur of lo tachmod. Okay, we'll hold it here for today. We'll continue with the next halacha. Everyone have a great day.